There was beeswax in the chapel air and lilies so white they seemed to measure the light. I remember the way the candles leaned toward the aisle, as if attentive. How the congregation sat like a series of deposited coins, arranged, counted, then set aside. My dress was the clean arithmetic of pleats and seams I had practiced in the mirror until each fold felt like a small, obedient promise. I had learned long ago to present myself as a solvable equation. Tidy gestures, precise answers, a ledger of favors rendered and owed. That night, I was balanced on two legs. He sat opposite me with the stillness of a building, measured angles, rightness at the shoulders, and when he looked at me, his face gave the impression of a thing returned by reflection, deliberate, and a beat late. People watched us the way one watches a ship that has taken its mooring, with relief and a mild astonishment that something so large could sit so easy in its place. My mother watched with the satisfaction of an accountant who has finally seen the numbers come to their neat conclusion. The solicitor sat in the front pew with his briefcase closed like a tomb. My brother, who had spent his childhood learning to keep me upright as if I might tumble like an unsteady cup, sat with his hands folded like a man who had taught himself stillness too. All the arrangements had been the family's doing, a match brokered by convenience and reputation, a meeting of ledgers where each party presented columns of what they could offer, stability, connections, an agreeable household reputation. A solicitor had come with a neat, polite offer, pinched in the middle like the waist of a well-tailored document. My mother spoke of provisions and dowry in the same breath as she spoke of lilies and pews. I had learned from her that marriage could be accounted for, that affection, while preferable, was a luxury beside the balance sheet of social survival. It comforted her to imagine my future as a book closed and stamped, entries crossed, obligations accepted, my name transferred into another margin. I told myself, as my grandmother's ring pressed coldly against my finger, that I wanted nothing more than the peace of a settled account. Yet even as I repeated the vows, with their precise cadence of "I do" and "for better or worse," something in the chapel behaved as if it were recording late. A hush would fall, and his expression would answer mine a fraction of a breath behind. A friend seated near the back later told me she thought him stoic. My mother called him composed. The solicitor called him a sound match. I called the lagging something I could live with, an eccentricity, a mannerism worth noting but not worth unraveling. If you find quiet, strange stories like this compelling, please tap like and stay for the rest. I promise, the real astonishment waits in the bridal chamber. After the ceremony, there were the usual exchanges, hands shaken, pastries offered, florists counting stems. The house was already humming with the staff's quiet business. Fires banked in the drawing room, tea set out in silver, the linens aired and folded with ritual affection. Yet, even amid the domestic hum, anomalies gathered like small, improbable coins in the carpet. The first was a portrait my cousin sent, a studio photograph taken the afternoon before, where his smile arrived a day late. In the frame, the light had caught me mid-laughter. His mouth, however, seemed to make up its mind to smile a whisper of a second later, so that when I looked at the print the following morning, his expression read like a reply to an absent remark. There were other small things that behaved oddly and bothered me because they refused to fit my categories. Mirrors would answer him a second later. A handheld looking glass that showed me the exact angle of my jaw returned his face as if it were holding onto an echo. Morning light in the guest room would outline his shadow, but the dust motes around where he had been took a heartbeat longer to settle. Servants noticed little gestures they could not name. He would set a teacup down precisely, then lift his hand as though he had meant to pick something else up. He folded napkins with the concentration of one cataloguing an inventory, eyes distant, as if considering the cost. The housekeeper muttered, not unkindly, about his being a touch different, and that phrase lodged in my throat like a bone. At dinner, he ate with a calm exactitude, He cut his meat into equal squares as if distributing portions across an unseen ledger. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his sentences were carefully measured, each clause cleaned of excess. Yet there was kindness in the way his hands moved when he cleared an emptied cup. People will forgive strange manners in a good table companion if the table is kept neat. My mother, who had tried to turn even conversation into accounts, took comfort in his regularity. She liked that he wiped his mouth with the wrong side of a napkin in private, because it meant he was not pretending. Those small oddities, catalogued and put away, were not what changed the course of the evening. They were the preliminary notes before the chord that would alter everything. The bridal suite had been prepared as if for a conclave of silence. Beeswax candles, their flames small and cognizant, lined along the dressing table where perfume bottles sat like tiny glass altars. The reflecting pool, one of the house's affectations, a shallow basin polished to a sheen, caught the candles and multiplied them into a city of flame that swam beneath the flicker of the room. I had admired the pool before, a miniature lake where one could see oneself optically altered, as though by a secret translation. That night, as I adjusted the lace at my throat and breathed in the scent of lilies, the pool reflected me in quick succession. Myself in the present, myself in the past, and then, a breath later, my husband's image answering mine as if some time had to be brokered between us. We shared the bed with the ceremony of strangers who have agreed to intimacy as an arrangement to be fulfilled. He lay on his back and watched the ceiling, calm, precise, until I too lay down and let the silk sheet whisper between us. The room felt enormous, as if its corners had been stretched by an unaccustomed hush. For a while there was a comfortable silence, the kind I had imagined would follow vows, a quiet that is not empty, but filled with the weight of two people who have kept their accounts and now sleep in the margins. Then, in a manner that was not dramatic in the storyteller's sense, but simply factual in the most discomforting way, I became aware that his breathing did not meet mine at the same rhythm. It was not the gasping of someone in the grip of fever, nor was it the steady, intimate in and out that we are taught to expect from bodies pressed close. It was a hum, low, steady, not quite the rise and fall of lungs, but a sound that seemed to vibrate from somewhere within rather than pass in and out. When I slid my hand to his chest, expecting the quick, flaring reassurance of a heart, my fingers met a surface that gave a faint, almost mechanical yielding. There was warmth. There was also a small, internal cadence that refused to match the tempo of my palm. I do not know what I had expected. Some people, when they touch another on the wedding night, report a sudden clarifying knowledge that the person beside them is wholly, recognizably human, that the soft tissue and breath and imperfection of mortality are all accounted for and present. I had rehearsed this discovery like a small play in the mirror, a gasp, a laugh, the discovery of a familiar pulse. Instead, I found an echo that answered a fraction too late, as if his body were a room in which sound arrived at the far wall and made its own patience. I asked him quietly, and because all my life I'd been taught to make questions small and serviceable, my voice was not large. "Do you have a heart?" I said, absurd in retrospect and precise in the way of a bookkeeper asking whether entries balance. He turned his head toward me with the slow, polite tilt of someone considering a page. "Do you mean it literally?" he asked. It was an odd answer. His voice did not rush to mend the breach. There was no denial, no attempt to veil. Instead, he said, "I am delayed. I am not entirely in time the way you seem to be. It takes me longer to arrive at the place feeling is kept." If anyone else had given me such a reply, I might have laughed or been vexed. Instead, I felt the room narrow into the space between us, as if someone had tightened a band. "Delayed," I said. The word felt leisurely in my mouth, as if I were balancing a new entry. He watched the small lines my fingers made on his chest. "I thought," he said slowly, "that if I could be near someone who inhabits time differently, who lets themselves be marked by small things, I might learn what it is to be more immediate. I do not know the proper words. I thought I might learn to feel the weight of the moment. There are moments when language does less than the heart needs, and more than politeness allows. I remember wanting to ask him where he had learned such restraint, whether it had been taught to him in a childhood of careful calendars and quiet rooms. But the bed was a neutral place, and his hands were open and not small. I could not tell if his admission was a confession or an explanation. I had learned from my mother that the best way to manage anomalies was either to fold them neatly into your plan or to return them to sender. All the reasons to leave presented themselves with the crisp logic of accounting. The solicitor would reimburse me the dowry in measured increments. My mother would reclaim the linens and the plates and restore the situation to its previous order. Rumor might not last if one made tidy gestures of separation. To walk away would be to correct the balance, to restore the book to order, to remove the anomalous footnote. And yet there was an industrious curiosity in his face, a willingness, not theatrical but earnest, to be taught. There was a humility in his asking that smelled faintly of soap and the wax used to seal letters. When he said, "I would like you to teach me," his voice was less a demand than a request that could be refused. The ledger of my life had long been written with rules about what was tolerable and what was not. Here in the dark, the choices were less arithmetic and more like a slow knitting. If I stayed, what patterns might be made from the stitches? I thought of my brother, who had once patched my knees with such solemnity that I had, as a child, thought stitches were a kind of blessing. I thought of my mother and her brief, fierce, practical ways. I thought of the solicitor, who had folded documents and signatures like origami, and how easily he would arrange a polite dissolution. And beneath all those public accounts was a private ledger that had nothing to do with contracts. A small register of tenderness I had carried through childhood like a secret coin. It was not prudence that made me hesitate. It was the odd, enlivening possibility of being the one to teach another how to be small, how to bruise and apologize, how to burn a finger and then notice the hurt. So I did what did not come naturally and yet felt not entirely impossible. I said, "Then learn." We made a plan that was less formal than a contract and more stubborn than a vow. The apprenticeship would begin with the ordinary rites I had been taught by my mother and by the careful servants of my father's household: bread, salt, ironing, the small domestics of human care. He would keep a book, an inventory of errors and adjustments, while I would keep watch over the practice. We would attempt the slow accumulation of habits that make a life less like economics and more like a ritual. The first morning felt like an experiment. There was a particular clarity to the light. It fell through the curtains, not as a single beam, but as a thin fidelity. I insisted on bread as a first lesson, because in my family bread had always been both sustenance and moral test. Can you wait for dough to rise? Can you be patient with yeast? Can you feel the heat without being overwhelmed? It seemed to me the simplest and most honest proof of a body's willingness to look after itself. We stood at the kitchen table, flour dusting the air like the first snow of a kind that does not clean, but rather insists on presence. He watched the sack of flour with the attention of a student, and yet his hands hovered as if the movements required were not merely physical but also temporal. When I set the bowl for him, he took it with the same precise care he had given to napkins and documents. His fingers cupped the ceramic as if memorizing the shape. I showed him how to fold flour into itself, how to press dough the way one presses a wound, gentle, insistent, patient. He did not laugh at the lump's awkwardness when it refused to bend to our will. He took notes, small, slanting figures in a leather book he had begun that morning. The first loaf was honest in its failures. It rose in unexpected places, cracked like a sun-baked river where we had not wanted it to. Salt, essence, and humility was misapplied. For a moment the bread tasted of excess, and then, as if forgiving itself, settled into something edible but not perfect. He sat back to test it, and that hum again made me acutely aware of his other rhythm. When he broke off a piece and handed it to me, there was a tiny ceremony in the way his thumb left a faint print on the crust, a fingerprint that would later be dusted with flour and become part of our shared domestic map. There were tender, ridiculous errors. He set the iron too high, and in the panic of saving a favorite shirt, his fingers blanched, and then he looked at the burn as if surprised by its banality. I showed him how to wet the stubborn seam and press the bead of heat out with slow, measured motions. He apologized with a precision that might have been rehearsed. Still, the apology arrived sincere. He recorded it in his book under a small heading, Irons, Misjudged Temperature, as if all lessons might be turned into corrective entries. The ledger of his failures began to read like the early pages of a handmade dictionary of human smallness. Neighbors started to murmur. The servants began to exchange glances that were not rude, but interested, as if the house had become the scene of an experiment worth observing. My mother, who had been prepared for an orderly merging of assets, now found herself confounded by the presence of a man whose errors required tending rather than correction. She came to the kitchen with an explicit look, countenance partled into practical concern. "He must be shown," she said stern, as if the problem could be addressed by a sufficient set of instructions. She made lists. She suggested tutors. She made the polite mistake of assuming that humanness could be taught by demonstration alone. There were small moments of humor between us. Once, in my impatience with a burnt kettle, I scolded him in a tone that usually belonged to the housekeeper and not to a wife in a new marriage. He took the rebuke as a problem to be solved. That afternoon he brewed tea with the fervor of a man translating a manual into practice. He watched for the silver thread that runs atop boiling water, and, when the steam threatened to scald his wrist, he yelped with a noise that was so unapologetically childish, I laughed until tears came to my eyes. It was a laugh of surprise, at the sound, at myself, at the sudden domestic joy of having another whose missteps could coax such an untrained and unaccountable reaction. The laughter broke things open. It was not theatrical, but real, and in its wake, the house seemed softer. Still, there lurked a ledger of consequences beyond our kitchen. The solicitor, who had first facilitated our arrangement, phoned with an even measuring politeness. He asked for confirmations, signed forms, minor amendments. He made clear in voice and manner that deviations from the expected arc, anomalous behavior, a failure to produce heirs in the expected timetable, had fiscal implications. My mother visited the breakfast table with lists of the dinners she expected us to attend, the aunties who must be assuaged, the charitable bazaars where a proper pair must be seen. Society kept its own accounts, and those columns must be balanced as well. Nevertheless, in the small hours between the bread trials and the ironing, in the quiet manner he would sit and record his missteps in that little leather ledger, I felt the distinct tingle of an exchange being made that was not currency in the old sense. I felt something like the opening of a new type of account, one where accumulated kindnesses accrue interest, where apologies are deposits, where the daily rituals of tending and being tended create a balance that is strangely more valuable than any dowry. One afternoon, several days into our private instruction, I discovered a freckle on his forearm as we sat mending a sleeve together. It was too small and perfectly ordinary to be remarkable in any rational way, and yet to me it felt like a signpost. For the first time his skin bore something that bore the mark of time in the way I recognized. An accident of sun, perhaps, or a memory of some earlier day. He traced it with a finger, as if surprised that pigment had chosen a place on his flesh. "You are gathering marks," I said, half teasing and half earnest. He looked at me with a slow gravity. "Yes," he said, "it appears I am keeping records." There will be those who read such a passage and insist on a categorical explanation, that his delayedness must be explained by origin, by science, by some mythic intervention. But the truth I can parcel is not origin but effect. The small accumulation of marks, mistakes, and apologies was beginning to alter the surface of things. Laughter loosened the stiffness of his shoulders. A burned thumb, once bribed by ointment and attention, became a story we told at the breakfast table. The reflecting pool stopped being a place where his image lagged and became instead a place where I watched both of us learn to stand in the same light, not perfectly in step, but close enough to share a shadow. And yet, even as the house softened into these private rituals, outside the silence had a different sound. Gossip. An aunt who had once sent a linen handkerchief with rude embroidery now sent a note of curious condolence. A luncheon guest, who had always had more opinions than manners, offered advice that was not meant to be kind. "Perhaps he needs keeping," she said. "It is fashionable, in polite society, to dress concern as counsel." The solicitor began to receive letters, innocuous, watchful, suggesting that certain accommodations might be necessary. There are always those who will transform vulnerability into speculation, who will invent markets for what should remain private. The staff grew protective in their own way. The cook began to add a little more salt to the porridge, as if an extra seasoning could stand in for tenderness. The housekeeper winked at me once and said, "He's learning to make tea without scalding." Her eyes, which are rarely tender, took on a softness that felt like a small domestic benediction. Days accumulated like ledger entries. A burn here, a freckle there, a laugh at a spilled pot. Not all of them were charming. There were moments of weariness that weighed on me like an unexpected tax. When the solicitor arrived unannounced with a set of questions, I found my patience thinned. When my mother spoke, already recalculating the social cost, I felt a twinge of resentment that I would be expected to keep all public faces placid while performing private ministrations. Still, there was a stubborn, quiet satisfaction in the work. Teaching someone to fold a sheet or to salt a soup was not the sum total of life's meaning, but it made a new kind of commerce possible, transactions of care that required no receipts. One evening, as I polished a silver tray while he sat at the window making lines in his error book, I found myself drawing a new kind of ledger in my head. The columns were not money but small mercies, a cup of tea without scolding, an apology offered without calculation, a burnt kettle baptized in shared laughter. I wrote the entry mentally and then scratched it again, as if erasing might make it truer. When he caught my eye, he closed the leather book and smiled, the action simple and unguarded. For the first time since the chapel, his answer to me arrived in a tempo that felt like accompaniment instead of delay. "We do not yet know whether those acts will be enough. There are larger reckonings ahead, a public curiosity, perhaps a crisis that will test the weight of our tender ledger. And there are all the quiet days that will need repeating, until habit becomes habit and not artifice." But in the morning light of the kitchen, with the imperfect loaf cooling on a cloth and the smell of beeswax still faint in the corners of the house, I felt something shift. The wedding night had changed the account, not by revealing some monstrous otherness, nor by delivering a miraculous cure, but by presenting me with a choice: to close the ledger and restore order, or to keep opening the book and inscribing a new, tentative currency of tenderness. He reached for the crust again, and this time his hand trembled just enough that it was entirely human. He bit, and his face moved to register taste, then surprise, then a small, genuine pleasure. He spoke with a mouth that had known hunger, and was now, in some small way, satiated. "Teach me," he said, and the sentence was no longer a single request, but a litany of future trials. We set the leather book between us on the table like a pact. The first page listed the failings of a single day: the loaf underproven, the iron misjudged, the kettle nearly boiled dry. At the end of the list he had written a small entry, barely legible: "Attempt at laughter succeeded." I put my finger on that line as if it were a seal. Outside, the house kept its accounts as well. There were visitors to receive, calls to answer, letters to be read. The solicitor would want assurances. My mother would have more lists. Society would continue its slow calculations. But for now, in the coolness of the kitchen where beeswax and bread scented the air, we had begun to inscribe another kind of number, one that could neither be stamped nor arranged in neat columns, but one that might, in time, add up to something worth the risk. It was a modest beginning, and I did not pretend it was enough. There were still gaps, periods where his reflections lagged, nights when his hum returned and settled like a second low instrument beneath conversation. Yet those moments no longer felt purely threatening. They were anomalies to be addressed with patience and habit, not with the immediate severity of public accounting. When I closed the book that night, the reflecting pool in the drawing room caught the candlelight and returned both of us, my face ahead of his, then his trailing behind in the pool's mirrored water, time doubling for a second and then smoothing again. I laid my hand on the place where a heart should be, feeling warmth and an odd, gentle vibration, and thought of the days ahead. The long apprenticeship of small, repeated kindnesses, the freckles, soft progress, the ledger of tenderness that might, in the end, stand in for a dowry the world would not recognize. There were practical things to arrange. The solicitor expected signatures, my mother expected appearances. There would be a luncheon, and a cousin more curious than discreet would arrive with questions. But for the first time since the vows, I felt that the work ahead was not merely to preserve reputation. It was to practice being present to the slow, unglamorous tasks that require us to risk patience and offer apologies without expecting immediate return. The night had altered the balance of my life. Whether it would redeem or ruin me remained to be written in the margins. There were practical things to arrange. The solicitor expected signatures. My mother expected appearances. There would be a luncheon, and a cousin more curious than discreet would arrive with questions. But for the first time since the vows, I felt that the work ahead was not merely to preserve reputation. It was to practice being present to the slow, unglamorous tasks that require us to risk patience and offer apologies without expecting immediate return. The night had altered the balance of my life. Whether it would redeem or ruin me remained to be written in the margins. Winter moved in with a slow deliberation. The beeswax that had scented the chapel and the ceilings of the suite now took residence as a faint undertone in the house, impregnating the creases of furniture and the joints of the windows. Our apprenticeship settled like flour on a cutting board, messy at first, then habitual, then necessary. The husband's little book multiplied its pages. He wrote in it as one would keep accounts, not of money, but of minutiae. April 3rd, burn left index finger. Applied salve. Apology. Adequate. The entries were brittle at the start, all the more tender because of their exactitude. I learned to read his hand and to find the sincerity between the ticks. We divided the days by rituals. Morning belonged to bread, to the slow practice of measuring flour, to the pause while yeast woke like a small animal, to the quiet hours of proofing that demanded, perhaps above all, patience. Midday became the domain of dressings and lists, mending a collar, hemming a sleeve, teaching him the particular art of tying a knot that would not come undone in public. Evenings were the time for soup and the litany of small apologies that a house holds for itself. On some nights he would sit at the table with his leather book open and read entries aloud as if reciting lines from a play. He read them not to mock, nor to correct, rather to make them live. Tea. First attempt, scalding risk, he would announce, and we would both laugh in a way that softened the margin between error and affection. We were not theatrical in our tenderness. There were no sudden declarations or neat epiphanies. The housekeeper burned candles more carefully now, and the cook, noticing the way his hand trembled once when stirring a heavy pot, began to ladle gravy with a steadier spoon and offer him the first helping by habit. These small attentions were offered without ceremony. They spread like a coat of varnish, thin but fortifying. And in the slow hours, when the reflecting pool caught us and multiplied our silhouettes, I learned to read the compound rhythms of his presence. The hum was still there, but sometimes it softened into a murmur that almost matched the pattern of my own breath. My mother, who had at first catalogued the problem and then tried to fix it by force of instruction, found herself gradually seeded. She came to the house with lists and suggestions that fell away like leaves when she saw the way he took a handkerchief with proper awkwardness, and then when we laughed at his gait, permitted herself to laugh as well. Still, she could not entirely unlearn accounting. When there were invitations to be accepted and events to be attended, she would sketch columns in the margins of her schedule, social appearances on one side, health observations on the other. I would find her sometimes seated near the kitchen table, a pencil in hand, hesitating between the two ledgers, and then, more often than before, erasing the numerical column and writing instead a single word: keep. There were scenes of domestic comedy that now belonged to a new currency. Once, in a bout of overconfidence, he attempted to polish a silver candlestick without first wrapping his hand in cloth. The heat leapt. He cried out in a noise that was both shocked and unassembled. And before I could move, he had pressed his palm to his mouth and apologized to the object as if he had misjudged a friend. The housekeeper, who had witnessed many calamities but had rarely allowed herself a private smile, said afterward, "He takes his mistakes like a gentleman." She meant the phrase as a compliment, and perhaps because she had cleaned away years of accident, as a small benediction. Outside, the city continued to run its own books. An aunt sent a tepid letter as if to record herself in the event of my shame. A luncheon companion made a joke about eccentric husbands that landed like a clumsy fork. The solicitor maintained an indirect pressure, coming by occasionally to ensure all affairs were in order. Which is to say that he reminded us, politely, of the costs that strayed behavior might entail. There are institutions that profit by neatness and lose appetite when life refuses to be tidy. We navigated those calls with the same measured delight and irritation as we navigated the more intimate lessons. A curiosity, however, began to seep in among the neighbors of a more benign sort. Children from the street, who had once been strictly kept at arm's length by the servants, intruded now in the afternoons to watch him attempt to fix a wheel or to try, clumsily, to practice folding a napkin. He would sometimes invite one in to show them how to press a seam. He would make little games of measurement, and the children would leave with flour on their noses and a better understanding of patience than their mothers would willingly credit. There is a pedagogy in domesticity that teaches the future by example rather than sermon. Watching him with those children, patient, curious, surprised, made me think of the apprenticeship as not merely bilateral but social. Our private transactions were rippling outward, altering expectations and tainting polite indifference with the scent of possibility. It was in such a rustle of ordinary life that the first real test came. It was the kind of accident that works in a home, sudden, mundane, and easily underestimated. A kettle, left too near the edge by haste, tipped when a housemaid stepped back to shield a child who had darted in. Water sloshed. Steam rose in a white panic. He reacted as if by instinct, a hand to save, a motion to wedge the thing back into place. In the scramble, he scalded his wrist and the skin broke, an angry red ribbon that flared like a flag. He did not cry out with melodrama, but with a raw, practical sound, an intake of hurt that conveyed both surprise and the registration of pain. I remember how the house blurred around us, the cook bringing salves, the housekeeper with a basin of cool water, my mother entering in a flurry of command. I remember pressing my own hand against his wrist and finding the mild electric heat that accompanies an injury, and then the hum that, for a moment, swelled as if to fill the house entirely. He sat very still while we did what we could. We doused the area, applied ointment and bandaged. He apologized, not for the accident but for the trouble it had caused. His voice held a strange smallness. "I misjudged pressure," he said, as if in his book he had logged an arithmetic error. Later, in the solitude of my chamber, I would read his hastily written note. April 28th. Kettle, miscalculation, wrist burned. Reaction, shock, tears, unexpected. The word tears made a crooked, tender echo in me. He had cried, yes, but it was the telling of it, the admission, that made the wound feel larger in the ledger of emotion than in the skin. The wound refused to be merely a domestic inconvenience. Within days, the scalded wrist grew angry with infection. Fever followed as a shadow follows the outline of a body. His hum changed in pitch. The delay that had been habit lengthened into a drowse. Nights were long and tight. He slept in fits, sweating, his skin clammy, his breath thin like moth wings. The house, which had softened into a place of small mercies, tightened in response, each corner attentive and anxious. Caregiving is a slow and honest thing. It requires repetitions that wear the caregiver down and also, paradoxically, make the caregiver's muscles stronger. I learned to read the changes in his face as a midwife to a new calendar. The way the furrow between his brows deepened when pain arrived. The interval in which he seemed to lose the facility of speech. The way his hand, once so precise, trembled without shame. I warmed water, prepared poultices my mother advised, and then abandoned, counted pills the solicitor had insisted we order, for contingency, and sat through nights when the house hummed gently, but his breath did not steady. The fever had a curious habit of shortening his delay for periods. Brief moments when his reflections matched mine, and his responses arrived as if the world had realigned. In those hours, he seemed truer. He smiled in ways that were not practiced. He reached for my hand with a warm authority that surprised me. In the darker spans, he would look at me with that same earnestness and appear farther away, the hum deepening, the lag growing. I kept the ledger of those hours in my head, as if such an account could be totaled and deciphered. Moments of clarity, episodes of distance, tending, medicating, apologizing. Society, which had tolerated our oddities as long as they stayed in private rooms, now pressed harder. A neighbor's friend, who made her living selling columnist gossip to the papers, noticed that a carriage had been sent to our house at odd hours. A woman of the town appeared one morning bearing a basket with best wishes and a request for an interview dressed as concern. She asked questions as a child prods a bruise, gentle at first, then more insistent. "How is he?" she would ask, and I would answer as a competent woman tends to a question, neatly, without excess. The solicitor, who had until now been the house's polite firewall against prying eyes, began to fidget at our table, clearing his throat about appropriate disclosures. There are always those who think spectacle is the currency of compassion. A man arrived one afternoon with the manner of someone who writes with a pen that cannot be smudged. He called himself an observer of curiosities, and wore a coat that had known better weather. At first he asked to see him as one might ask to see a specimen. He spoke of papers and pamphlets, of how stories of oddity could bring people to the doors of theaters and salons, how sympathy, when well placed, can be monetized. His eyes flicked to my mother, who, despite all, still kept one eye on the social math. The man suggested, with a smiling earnestness, that we might arrange a public demonstration of recovery or regression, a way to place our private experiment into the ledger of public interest. I told him, in a voice that tried to balance firmness and civility, that we were not specimens. The man tilted his head and wrote the word "amusing" on an invisible pad. "It is not my intention," he said, "to exploit, but knowledge is public good. Knowledge can be argued to be charity and all the more dangerous for it." I showed him to the door. My refusal, though polite, did not entirely close the matter. Gossip is a small fire that smolders before it burns. It leaves embers that later flare under different winds. The solicitor, ever alert to obligation and consequence, said at the table one evening, "You must be aware that public curiosity, if unshaded, can bring difficulty. There are philanthropic societies that will try to assist you, and they will insist on making records. Records invite scrutiny." He said the words with a bland face. His concern was less for my husband than for the balance sheet, society's interests and the risk they represented. My mother, for all her new softness, began to hedge again. She offered to host a luncheon, ostensibly to reintegrate us into social life, but perhaps also to demonstrate to their circle that we were manageable and that our household remained respectable. Guests would be invited selectively, friends who understood discretion, acquaintances who knew how to speak gently. She wrote lists again, but this time with an extra column. Names of those who might be true allies, names of those who would be dangerous to us. In private, she confessed that certain friends had asked impertinent questions and that the solicitor had been visited by an emissary from a society concerned with unusual conditions. The luncheon arrived like a small festival of manners. My mother fussed until the milk in the custard reached the exact temperature she preferred, and the odd cousin who liked scandal stayed away, perhaps having heard in advance that the house would present only an ordinary afternoon. We received our guests with a practiced air. The husband moved among them with a diffident ease, answering questions with economy and then retreating to corners where he could watch the patterns of reflection. For a while the day held as proof against rumor. People complimented the roast, admired the beeswax-finished table, and said in asides that we seemed settled. Yet even that veneer could not hold against the smallness of human curiosity. A woman asked over tea, "Does he ever feel?" and then faltered, seeking the proper word. "Well, his delay. Does it ever make life difficult?" I answered as I had learned to answer, with a combination of candor and restraint. "At times," I said, "but we are learning." The woman nodded, as if learning were a category of which she approved from a distance. Her eyes, however, held the gleam of someone cataloguing an oddity she might later recount at another table. If the lunch was an exposure, then the illness became an intimacy. The fever had seared out any pretense that we were merely keeping a private misadventure. It demanded real labor. I cannot pretend that the nights were not difficult. They were. I rose to attend him at intervals, made lime compresses with the housemaid, slept for pieces beneath the sound of the house waking. The cost was not only time. There were financial expenses, the solicitor's quiet suggestions for paid consultations, the purchase of medicines from an apothecary who looked upon our case with the same mix of professional curiosity and patronizing wonder. There was the slow erosion of the life one once imagined, dinners missed, social obligations postponed, and yet none of that ever seemed as weighty as the watching. It was during one of those long nights that my brother came. He arrived without fanfare, in the dark, and sat with us by the bed. He had always been spare of language and lavish in care. He took up small tasks that the servants left untouched. He cut bandages, warmed sponges, and chatted to my husband in the quiet way brothers speak, with a dryness that masks tenderness. Watching them, I thought back to childhood while my brother had tied my knees and done countless small repairs to a clumsy life. Now, into our domestic triage, he brought that same wounded devotion. My husband, under pain and rest, spoke in fragments. He confessed, in what may have been a fever dream or sincere admission, a memory that could not be tied to a single origin. "There are places," he said softly, eyes half-lidded, "where time is kept very strictly, where being premature or late is a kind of sin." He paused. "I think that is where I learned to be delayed." I asked him, in the dark, whether that place was a home of people or of habits. He smiled without the strength to form the shape of the answer. Perhaps both, he said. Perhaps habit is as much a house as brick. My brother, who listens for the useful word, said little. He wrapped the bandage with the pragmatic hands of a boy who had once held my small limbs steady. "You look like yourself," he told my husband at one point, and there was no irony in it. He meant the shape of his humanity remained despite the hum. There are small phrases that, in crises, become bridges. The weeks that followed were the kind of close labor that strips away artifice. We argued, quietly and with civility, about methods. The husband would resist certain medicines on account of their taste. He refused at first the suggestion of a doctor's invasive examination, fearing perhaps that scrutiny would attempt to catalogue him into a known box. I, who had long made peace with practical compromise, wanted to balance caution with care. We negotiated as if we were reconciling ledgers. Here a concession, there an insistence. As much as the illness diminished him, it also offered a strange growth. It drew more of a language of tenderness from him, small confessions and thanks that were not mere protocols, but nervous, heartfelt stumbles. There were nights of fear. Once, when fever rose cruelly, I pressed my palm to his chest and felt the hum stutter into something thin and tremulous. He looked at me in a way that was neither delayed nor immediate, but entirely present in a frightened way I had not seen before. "If I do not learn," he whispered, "what becomes of us?" It is a foolish question to answer straight away. There are no guarantees in the tender arts. I told him what I believed in the quiet, that the small accounts of kindness could be as binding as any document if one kept paying into them. Convalescence moved like tide, long, then retreating, then coming back. He lost weight and then regained some. His color left the cheeks and then returned in patches. His delay shortened occasionally, like the diminishing echo in a great hall. Each small improvement felt like a deposit, and each relapse like withdrawal. Yet something deeper altered. In the scrabble of care and the hum of the house, we had forged routines that rivaled contracts in their binding power. I would not say we were healed. Perhaps the better word was tended. There is a difference between a sudden miracle and a patient craft. We practiced the latter. And then there came an event that could have broken us, but instead, in its peculiar way, sealed us. A carriage on a wet morning, a sluice of mud, a miscalculated step. These are the ingredients of accidents. He slipped in the yard and struck his hip against the stone. At the time we thought the blow superficial. His stoic manner suggested it was so. But that night, weakness took hold in his leg. The next day he could not put his weight upon it. I sat with him, holding his hand while he tried to make sense of the pain, and felt the ledger of our life tilt again. There was a fracture, not dramatic but troublesome. The house doctor recommended rest and careful nursing. My mother called for urgent consultation. The solicitor asked if insurance covered convalescence. The world, in its various departments, shuffled its papers. Convalescence in a large house is a communal performance. The servants adjusted their rounds, the cook sent up nourishing broths, the housekeeper ensured the rooms were warm, and that the reflecting pool's curtains were drawn to keep the drafts at bay. It was in these small rehearsals, warm cloths, rearranged pillows, a kettle steaming always nearby, that the domestic liturgies took firm hold. Night after night I sat by him, wordless at times, keenly aware of each breath and the uneven metronome of the hum. His face, when he slept, relaxed into lines I recognized as belonging to a person who had learned to surrender into the care of another. The surrender was not humbling for either of us, rather it was a mutual admission that we were, as human beings, dependent. There is a hideous romance in sickness narratives that insists on grandeur. Our days were, by contrast, filled with the small, tiding wet scarves, encouraging him to sip broth, massaging the leg until his muscles unclenched enough to breathe. There were moments of embered comedy. He attempted to read aloud from a book and fell into sleep mid-sentence. He apologized repeatedly for the inconvenience of being alive. I laughed at that sometimes, and my laughter was not mocking, but a release of a pressure I had carried for weeks. The laugh sharpened into a thing that felt like companionship. The neighborhood watched in a blend of concern and delight. A pamphleteer came again, not bold this time, but cautious. He had been rebuffed before. Now he found himself in the drawing room with my mother, who maintained a practiced defense. "We appreciate your interest," she said coolly, "but this house will accept no interviews." Courtesy, in the end, is a stronger defense than scolding. The man left, his pen less fruitful for the day. When the fracture mended, and it did, slowly with careful attention, the change in my husband was subtle but obvious. He began to notice the small discomforts in his body as signs rather than evidence of otherness. A twinge in the ankle meant too much walking. A small swell on a knuckle indicated a strain. The freckle on his forearm multiplied into a constellation. A small scar from the kettle remained like punctuation. The hum persisted but did not dominate. In the reflecting pool, his image began to answer mine with less of a lag. Once, as we stood together adjusting the curtains, I caught the reflection of his hands and mine, moving nearly in synchrony. There was no trumpet of miracle, only the quiet marvel of practice making habit of tenderness. The ledger I had been keeping in my head hardened into something I could name and thereby value. Its columns recorded acts rather than obligations. One caring for a scalded hand, one night of vigil, one apology issued without calculation, one loaf baked and shared. Interest accumulated not in percentage points, but in the ease with which the other's mistakes could be received. We started to tally not for the sake of scorekeeping, but to ensure memory would not erase the practice. I would sometimes reach into the book for a particular entry. June 14th, attempted laughter, succeeded. The small triumphs were, in the end, the most reliable proof of change. Yet for all the intimacies and the small progress, the world outside remained a contingent ledger. We were seen sometimes as an oddity to be narrated. A charity woman visited and tried, with misguided zeal, to arrange a public exhibition of progress. She spoke of inspirational tales and the uplift of witnessing resilience. I asked her gently to leave and to allow us privacy. My refusal, which might have been taken as curtness in another context, was this time accepted because the scandalous appetite of society had been tempered by our firmness. There is a point at which the insistence of privacy itself becomes an act of moral demonstration. There were moments of embarrassment, once when the husband, in his mechanical earnestness, recited aloud a list of our household missteps in the drawing room while guests were present. I flushed, and then to my surprise laughed. The guests, taken by the levity rather than the impropriety, laughed with us. The laughter converted awkwardness into intimacy and softened the boundary between the public and private. It was a small victory. Over months, the husband's notebook shifted in tone. Where once the entries read like cold prescriptions, "Do not overboil kettle," they gradually acquired other headings. He began to catalogue not only mistakes but details he liked. June 2nd, bread, smell of crust pleasing, wife smiles upon tasting, note to self, more salt. He recorded the sound of my laugh, the way the reflecting pool looked at dusk, the name of the housemaid who had taught him to ladle soup without hesitation. The ledger had turned into something resembling a diary of attention, an accounting of small human delights alongside necessary corrections. Our acquaintances noticed the shift. My mother, who had once balanced her care with measurement, allowed herself to call him by a nickname she had never used before. The housemaid, who had stooped under the weight of many servants' traditions, began to ask him for advice on small things. How to press a seam, how to line up napkins, because he, through practice and patience, had earned authority in ways that had nothing to do with birthright. Slowly, the household adjusted its hierarchy not by pedigree, but by demonstrated care, and still the hum remained. It became not the dominant feature of our life, but the low note that sometimes threaded through it, like the undertone in a song that gives depth rather than dissonance. There are things that do not vanish because we wish them gone. They only become less loud when love's habits provide other sounds to listen to. There will always be men of late reflection and women who take them in. I will not assert that the husband had become wholly, recognizably, the sort of man one expects in public squares. He remained, in many ways, an animated question. That question is not an indictment. It is the occasion for practice. There were gifts, too, that arrived without calculation. A neighbor sent a jar of beeswax salve for his wrist. Another gentleman's wife, who once had been as dignified as my mother, visited and brought a small loaf she had baked. "We all need hands to learn," she said, handing over bread. The words were not a proclamation of change, but a note that others saw and chose in some manner to endorse the work we were doing. These small alliances mattered. I began to notice changes in the minutiae. The way his reflection in the pool joined mine and caught up more quickly. The way his laughter no longer felt like a rehearsed obligation, but a spontaneous response to the absurdity of burnt toast. The faint, stubborn newness of a freckles neighbor. Once, as we stretched a sheet together, his fingers faltered and then steadied, and he murmured purely to himself, "Now I know why one folds a corner twice." The sentence was prosaic and beautiful, because it marked understanding of an ordinary act. As the seasons shifted, we found ourselves reconfiguring the social maps that had once outlined our lives. Invitations came and were accepted on different terms. We no longer attended as a display of proper balance, but as companions who had learned a trade of care. Some friends withdrew, uncertain how to fit our story into their comfortable assumptions. Others came closer, curious and willing to live with a small awkwardness in exchange for the pleasure of company. There was, finally, an episode that I will record not as proof of transformation, but as testament to the durability of tenderness. A winter evening, when the rain ran hard against the windows and the reflecting pool held only a grey sky. My husband, who had been working by the hearth on a small repair, glanced up at me and reached for my hand. His fingers closed around mine with a pressure that was neither calculating nor rehearsed. He had been working on a small mechanical clock, an attempt to understand rhythmic time by making one himself. He showed me the tiny gear he had mended. "I wanted," he said, examining the teeth of metal as if they were scripture, "to give myself a time I could mark." I looked at him and, for reasons I cannot entirely locate in language, placed my palm upon his chest. The hum was present but quieter, a thing that no longer defined his personhood. "You have learned a great many small things," I said. "You have learned to be present when presence requires work." He smiled in that small way, a private warming, and then, as if in a rehearsal long practiced and now finally genuine, he leaned in and kissed my hand. The kiss was a tidy, earthly thing, not an explosion of romantic declarations, but a sealing of countless small agreements. It acknowledged hurts tended, errors tolerated, apologies given. It was not triumphant. It was sufficient. There remained, as there should in any sensible life, uncertainties. I cannot promise that the hum will resolve itself into a perfect rhythm, nor can I say that the ledger of tenderness secures us against future trials. But what I can say is that the choice I made on that first night, the choice to stay and teach rather than to return my dowry and restore a neat arithmetic, has been a long curriculum of practice. Our life now is less a balance sheet and more a book of domestic liturgies. Bread baked and shared, sheets folded and smoothed, a salve dabbed on an aching wrist, an apology offered with no calculation. Perhaps the truest measure of change is not a tally of improved behaviors, but the degree to which the household has been reshaped by patience. My mother now keeps a jar of salve beside the tea service. The solicitor, though still fond of tidy documents, has learned to knock and then stand in the doorway until invited. The servants, once deferential and distant, now offer counsel on small matters and laugh often at breakfast. The husband, for his part, wears a faint scar on his left thumb where the kettle burned him, an index of a life lived in attempts and recoveries. When I sit by the reflecting pool on certain evenings, tea at hand and beeswax sheen catching low light, I watch the slow interplay of our images. Sometimes my reflection leads, sometimes his does. The delay that once felt like a categorical divide has become a texture between us, a place where patience is practiced and where habits are retooled. He remains as he always was, a man who arrives in time in his own way. That arrival now sometimes syncs with mine, sometimes it does not. Both states have taught me to keep accounts differently. We have built, page by patient page, a different kind of ledger. On its lines are the small, repetitive entries that do not interest the world of notice, but that in the end compose a life. A cup of tea made without scolding, a burned thumb attended to with calm, laughter that arrives uncalculated, sheets that are folded in a way that shows someone has cared for them. It is not glamorous bookkeeping, and it would make my mother blush to think of a ledger not in terms of fortune, but of affection. Yet if I were to sign a balance now, I would not write sums and numbers but the names of small mercies. If the title of this account promises a sensational pivot, if it suggests that on our wedding night I discovered something monstrous, and then, as if in a fable, we either transformed or were undone, then I will say this. The wedding night did change everything, but not by revelation of a monstrous otherness, nor by an instantaneous cure. It changed everything by forcing a choice upon me that had until then lain dormant. The choice to convert a social contract into a moral practice, to exchange the tidy arithmetic of reputation for the slow, often irritating accounting of care. That choice bore consequences that were, in the mundane arithmetic of living, costly. Time spent away from society, money dispensed for medicines, the patience required to watch someone learn what we imagine to be natural. It also brought rewards that are not easily measured. The sound of laughter that surprises us, a freckle whose presence tells a story of sun and days, a scar that reads like punctuation on a life. There is an elegance to the domestic arts that can be mistaken for smallness. Folding a sheet neatly, brewing a tolerable cup of tea, knowing when to be silent and when to speak. These are not trifles. They form a grammar of human closeness. In teaching another these things, one does not perfect them. One only practices them until habit presses into being. Perhaps that is the most honest kind of change. Not the sudden miracle, but the accumulation of daily acts so numerous that they alter the face of a life. Now, months after that first furtive test of a hand upon a chest, we move through our house with a new vocabulary. There is the beeswax, still faint and luminous at corners. The lilies, which my mother insists on tending. The reflecting pool, which continues to tease us with its delicate refusals and returns. The ledger sits on the kitchen table sometimes, open to a page where he writes the oddest notations. October 2nd. Observed, wife, shows small kindness unbidded. Note, gratitude. When I find such entries, I press my finger to the ink as if to seal them. People will ask if they hear our story, whether I regret my choice. There are days, of course, when patience frays and public obligations shout. There are nights when the hum returns sharp and I am tired. But these are the costs of keeping an odd life. They are also the price of learning, with the slow stick-to-it of hours, how much tenderness can do. The ledger of tenderness does not promise neat balances. It only promises that when one opens the book, one will find evidence of care rendered and received. Sometimes I think of the solicitor, his briefcase like a closed little tomb. He taught me, if nothing else, the force of a signed document. My mother taught me the power of lists. The husband taught me a different lesson entirely, that the heart, if one uses the word cautiously, can be cultivated by routine and apology and the patient repetition of small failures turned into habit. We are apprentices still. We will be so until home wears us down into better people or until life moves on and hands us other work. It is not a satisfying denouement in the way a storybook offers tidy endings. It is a life. It is slow. It contains grief and joy in equal, often boring measure. It contains the reflecting pool's small betrayals and gifts. Most of all, it contains the fact that I, who had been prepared to balance and to be balanced, chose instead to keep adding entries to a different kind of account. The last time I stood by the reflecting pool and watched our images ripple, I reached for his hand, as if to test the slow time between us. He looked at me, and with a small, human impatience, proof that his learning was not complete, he said, "Teach me again," as he had said that first desperate night, but now with steadier tone. I laughed and guided his fingers to the bread, to the salt, to the iron's safe temperature. We were not a spectacle. We were simply two people who had learned the labor of living with one another. The wedding night changed everything for me because it forced a decision, one between tidy accounts and the risk of tenderness. I chose the latter, and the days since have proven that choice costly and luminous in equal measure. There is no final victory to announce, no miraculous transformation that would satisfy a curious spectator. There is only the ledger of small acts, the tally of attention, and the binding effect of repeated kindness. If this small peculiar story moved you, subscribe for more strange and tender narratives.